Has our environment passed the point of no return? Michael Mann, one of the world's leading climate scientists, answers. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. The inventor or promoter, or I don't know what the right word would be, of the whole hockey stick idea that kind of made Al Gore so famous. He's the author of several books, including his latest out in January. It's available now for pre-sale wherever you find fine books. It's titled The New Climate War. His previous book, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. His website, michaelmann, MANN.net, and you can tweet him at Michael E. Mann. Dr. Mann, it is always an honor to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to kind of walk through at least the table of contents of your book over the course of this hour, if you're up for that. And I'm curious, before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on here, what is front and center on your dashboard? What are the things that you, as a climate scientist, as one of the world's leading climate scientists, and I noticed your new book, Greta Thunberg and Al Gore and a whole bunch of really great people have endorsed it. What are you looking at that has you the most alarmed and the most hopeful?
Thanks, Tom. Well, it's always good to be with you, my friend. And, I am actually quite hopeful in general right now. There are reasons for cautious optimism. We've gotten rid of the single greatest threat to climate action in the world, which was Donald Trump. And so now we can see on the horizon the potential for meaningful action. But you ask, what are the things that worry me? Well, what worries me is that we have to reduce our carbon emissions by a factor of 2 within the next decade if we're going to keep warming below truly catastrophic levels. And we're not yet on track to do that. Even with the lockdown and social distancing policies of COVID-19 this year, we're probably only going to see a reduction in carbon emissions by 4 or 5% or so, and we need to do more than that, at least 7.5% a year for each of the next 10 years if we're going to stay on track. So both hopeful, cautious optimism that we can now see a path forward, that the U.S. will now be in a position to re-engage with our global partners to really tackle this problem, but concern about the monumental nature of the task that we face.
Correct my memory if I'm wrong on this, and I may well be. But my recollection is that the United States, with about 4% of the world's population, contributes between 20 and 25% of the world's pollution, that our principal source of carbon pollution is our transportation system. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is housing and buildings, commercial buildings. And number 3 is agriculture. If I have that right, what do we do in each of those areas, and how do we move forward? I mean, in transportation, for example, I think the UK just announced over the weekend that starting 2030, they're going to ban the sale of internal combustion engines. Norway did that, last year or the year before? Other countries are doing that around the world. Electric cars are growing like crazy. We're seeing more and more wind and solar power providing the electricity for them. So where do we go? What does it look like?
Yeah, so again, a little bit of good news there. That's something that the Biden administration can act on immediately. Even without congressional approval, we can make sure that the EPA, for example, tightens those fuel efficiency standards, which have become lax under the Trump administration. So we need to decarbonize transportation. You're right. That's one of the major sectors. There are actually really 4 contributors that major contributors we think of these days: transportation, but power generation, of course, electricity generation, as well as agricultural policies, land use policies, and buildings. Buildings produce both the construction of buildings and their power usage generates a large amount of carbon emissions. So, there's no one silver bullet. Each of, all of the sectors that make up society contribute to our carbon emissions. And so we really need to, we need a multi-pronged effort to really tackle carbon emissions in every sector of society. the good news, again, is that what the incoming Biden administration is looking at is a plan. You may have come across it. There was a plan basically written mostly by folks from the Obama administration who didn't have a chance to complete the plan when when Obama was in office. But basically, it's a strategy for using all of the agencies in the government and basically every lever that the chief executive has, which means not just transportation and energy policy, but agricultural policy, as you allude to, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury can, for example, require companies and corporations to disclose climate risk and allow investors an opportunity to take that into account in their decision making. So really, every single sector of the government, there are ways that we can, use those sectors to advance an agenda of decarbonizing our civilization. And that's sort of what Biden is looking at. It may really be about executive actions, at least for the next 2 years, depending on what the Senate looks like after these two upcoming special elections.
Yeah. There was a fascinating article in Nature last week about the discovery of a 1.2 million year old, or maybe a little older than that even, hominid fossil that the headline was Evolution in Real Time, that apparently climate change had altered part of the South African landscape. And this particular hominid developed larger jaw and stronger muscles to chew the more fibrous plants that were able to survive the drought. And I tweeted about this, and the response I got was, yes, humans can evolve. We don't have to worry about climate change. We'll simply evolve to meet it. It's like, oh. So, along those same lines, there's this headline over on Common Dreams. Humans may have passed the point of no return in climate crisis, says study. This was published in the peer-reviewed British publication Scientific Journals. Quote, the world has already passed a point of no return for global warming, and now we need to extract enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Do you agree with that analysis?
So there are a couple different things that have come out over the last week, and there was this one study arguing that we've gone beyond the point of no return based on a pretty flawed climate modeling approach, and other scientists in the field aren't taking it that seriously. In fact, I believe they retracted the press release that they put out for this article in Scientific Reports. But there was also an open letter in The Guardian that I was a co-signatory of, along with George Mann and a number of other individuals who have sort of been advancing this framing that we have to reduce carbon emissions, of course. We have to stop burning fossil fuels, but we should also be doing everything we can to take up that carbon, to draw down that carbon, ideally through natural means, massive reforestation, more carbon-friendly agricultural policies. And again, here's where the Biden administration can actually, help, for example, provide incentives for farmers to use farming practices that bury carbon. There's a lot that we can do there, and that's going to be part of the solution. It's going to be part of the solution as far as domestic policy, climate policy is concerned here in the U.S., but the larger effort to confront the climate crisis.
I was reading this morning that we are now providing more than nearly $700 billion a year in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry in the United States. And I don't think that number includes the hundreds of billions of dollars that we spend protecting shipping lanes for transporting oil from Saudi Arabia to the United States, from the United States, refined oil out of the United States, things like that. So it's probably even, closer to $1 trillion. That's a mind-boggling amount of money. If we were to redirect even 5 or 10% of that to subsidies for green power, much less 50 or 100% of that, what impact would that have?
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it, that we're providing subsidies, we're subsidizing, incentivizing energy extraction of fossil fuels and energy generation that's doing damage to the planet, rather than providing incentives for the energy solutions to this problem, renewable energy. And so we have it's a perversion of the incentive structure in our energy economy. And again, that's one thing that we can try to do now under the incoming Biden administration. I mean, ultimately, if we really want to tackle that problem, we would want congressional buy-in, and we would want a Congress that is willing to advance, legislative policies that, put a price on carbon, that provide subsidies and incentives for renewable energy. There's a fair amount that the president can do through executive actions, but a comprehensive solution would require a Congress that's willing to work with the president. And if we don't get that come January, then that's something that Democrats need to run on over the next 2 years, a do-nothing Congress that refuses to act on climate. That would be, I think, a commanding political agenda to try to seize back control of the Senate by Democrats. Then we would really be in a position to solve this problem in a comprehensive way. But there's no question that the first thing that we have to do is to cut explicit subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. And Joe Biden has committed to doing that. During the campaign, he committed to doing that. We need to make sure that he follows through on that commitment, because that's the first thing we can do is to cut these subsidies, to stop investing in additional fossil fuel infrastructure. These are things that the executive branch can do, that an incoming President Biden could do immediately.
Yeah, what's the old saying? Before you take the aspirin for your headache, stop banging your head against the wall?
That's right. It also reminds me of, the Hippocratic oath, a version of which is, first do no wrong. And here, subsidizing the fossil fuel industry is doing wrong. It's literally throwing fuel on the fire, almost figuratively and almost literally.
Dr. Mann, if we could just bounce through some of the points in your new book, The New Climate War. And you start out in the book with a chapter titled "The Architects of Misinformation and Misdirection." What is misinformation specifically in the context that you're using it here? And misdirection, how are they different? And who are these architects?
Yeah, so the misinformation or disinformation is the purveying of climate change denial by fossil fuel interest groups, talking heads who have advocated for them, sort of the usual suspects, industry-funded climate change deniers who have engaged in an intentional effort over decades to basically poison the public discourse over really all matters of environmental sustainability, but in particular climate change, because tackling the climate crisis represents a threat to the very powerful vested interests, the fossil fuel industry, who have funded this campaign of misinformation, disinformation. Misdirection is really, extension of that. Distractions, deflections away from sort of the source of the problem, the burning of fossil fuels, efforts to deflect our attention away from the need to actually do something about fossil fuel burning, get away from our reliance on fossil fuels, deflecting the discussion towards other issues like individual behavioral change, which is another theme of the book and the main theme of another chapter.
Yeah, which is, and let's drill down just a little bit into that, because this has historically been one of the ways that dirty industries, killer industries, avoid regulation. We saw this with the tobacco industry. Well, everybody knows, post-1960s, everybody knows tobacco causes cancer, so it's a matter of individual responsibility. Mike Pence writing an op-ed back in 2000 saying, well, cancer doesn't cause, 9 out of 10 people who smoke don't get cancer or something like that. and
Right.
as if 1 out of 10 is good enough. And
Well, and the gun
it's
lobby,
all
right?
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, guns
The
don't
gun
kill
lobby
people.
as well,
People
right?
kill people. Exactly.
Yeah. There
Yeah.
you are. Yep.
So how does this play out with regard to climate change?
Yeah. So, as the impacts of climate change have become obvious, so profound that it really is incredible to deny them. And I say that here as we've just witnessed the latest Category 5 hurricane on record forming in the Atlantic with Iota. It's strengthened to a maximum sustained winds 160 mile per hour Category 5 monster, and it will soon make landfall in Central America and probably do great harm, and we expect loss of life. The impacts of climate change are playing out in real time. It is incredible to deny them. So instead, the forces of inaction, what I call the inactivists, have sort of moved on from sort of hardcore climate change denial to softer denial. Oh, well, maybe it's happening and it's due to us, but, it's not that bad and we can adapt. Or the use of sort of other tactics in what I call the new climate war. We've talked about one of them, deflecting attention away from the need for systemic change and policy solutions to individual behavior. Oh, it's, all about you as an individual. And that's the commonality, in what we're seeing today in sort of the climate arena with the deflection campaigns of yore, with the tobacco industry, or as I said, the gun lobby. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. Make it about individuals. And I tell the story in the book. I'm not the first one to tell this story, but it's an important one. Thom, you probably remember that public service announcement in the early 70s. I grew up, the Crying Indian ad, as it's called.
Oh, yeah.
The tearful, the tearful Native American. And it was about, people cause pollution. People can clean it up. That was sort of the tagline, or paraphrasing the tagline. But the public service announcement was aimed at convincing us that the solution to the bottle and can litter accumulating in the environment, polluting our streams and rivers and countryside, that was due to us not being responsible enough. Well,
Dr. Mann, we were you had a thought that you wanted to wrap up about individual responsibility in the Crying Indian ad, just as we hit the break there on the other end.
Yeah. So we many of us from that generation remember that ad, and it had a profound impact on us. It sort of felt like it empowered us to be good stewards of the earth and clean up the bottle and can litter. And there was so much about it that seemed so good. And what's so tragic is that it was all a sham. It was a publicity effort by the beverage industry, Coca-Cola and other beverage companies, who were afraid of the passage of bottle bills in states like the state I grew up in, Massachusetts. The bottle bill would put a deposit on bottles and cans. Ultimately, it would force the beverage companies to process that waste and to recycle and process those bottles and cans, and it would cut into their profits. So what they did instead was to engage in this massive deflection campaign, and they even got some environmental organizations to go along with it, at least initially, until they realized that they had been had, that what this really was a deflection campaign aimed at diverting attention away from the need to pass bottle bills, instead making it about individual behavior. We just have to be better people and clean up our bottles and cans. And it was very successful for them. Ultimately, we never saw bottle bills passed in most of the states, and there's no national bottle bill. And what do we have as a result? One of the other tragic global environmental problems of our time, global plastic pollution, plastic pollution in the bottom of our oceans, because of this successful campaign on the part of industry to deflect attention away from the need for policies and systemic solutions. And the fossil fuel industry is doing it today. They're using the same playbook, and often they are enabled by mainstream news outlets like the New York Times that publishes dozens and dozens of articles every year about all the things that we can do as individuals to reduce our carbon footprint. The individual carbon footprint was a notion that was actually put forward by BP, because they wanted to make it all about individuals rather than systemic solutions, climate policy, price on carbon, incentives for renewable energy, the systemic changes that we know are necessary if we're really going to tackle this problem. And make no mistake, we should all do those things that we can do in our everyday lives to reduce our carbon footprint, things that save us money, they make us healthier, they make us happier, they set a good example for others. There's so many other reasons to do them, but those voluntary measures alone aren't going to solve this problem. We need policies that will move people collectively in the direction we need to go. And so we have to be aware that the deflection campaign tactics that were used in the past are being used very effectively by the fossil fuel industry today to try to steer the discussion away from the need for climate policy.
When Louise and I were working on Leo DiCaprio's new movie, Ice on Fire, we traveled with the film crew from, it really was. And I believe you and I are both in it. And we traveled from Costa Rica to Norway to Germany to, we traveled all over the world. And repeatedly, what climate scientists that I was doing most of the interviews, and Lila Connors, the producer, did probably the other half of them. And repeatedly what we were told was that putting a price on carbon was the single most effective thing that could be done at the level of government action. Does that comport with your understanding of the situation?
Yeah, I think it's a very important part of the toolkit. And it's not a, it's not a cure-all. It's not a magic bullet, to use that expression again. It's one tool in the toolbox that we have. Putting a price on carbon, and we have to do it in a way that is just. One of the things that has become controversial is the potential for a carbon tax, if not sort of implemented appropriately, to basically put the greatest burden on those with the least resources, those who had the least responsibility for creating the problem in the first case. And so, we need, if we're going to put a price on carbon, it has to be done in a progressive manner that makes sure that we don't, put the greatest burden on those with the least resources and who've had the least role. We need to make sure that it's fair to frontline communities, and that it's not a regressive, but rather a progressive.
Are there any examples out there? Are there countries that have done this successfully?
Yeah. Australia had what they called an emissions trading scheme. Some people called it a tax. It's sort of a semantic issue, but they did have a price on carbon. Yeah, it was sort of somewhere between a cap and trade and a carbon tax. And in the end, the opponents, the liberals, who are actually the conservatives in the Australian government, they're called liberals. They're neoconservatives, and they sort of labeled it as a tax because they knew that sort of framing was most likely to reduce support from the public. And there was a campaign by the Murdoch press that basically owns Australia, that controls the media environment in Australia, and the conservative government, with the liberals, to get rid of that emissions trading scheme. So it had been implemented. It cut emissions by more than 10% in the first 6 months. It actually ended up providing revenue to the disadvantaged. It actually was, it didn't hurt them. It actually returned revenue in a progressive manner. And so frontline communities actually benefited from it, not just from the climate action that it was advancing, but the pricing mechanism. And so it was a great example of something that worked. It reduced carbon emissions. It wasn't. It didn't do so in an unjust way. It actually was progressive. And the conservative government ultimately actually campaigned, and the Murdoch press helped them basically campaign on this issue through misinformation and disinformation, convince the public that this was somehow a bad thing, and they were able to reverse it. And so Australia had a successful carbon pricing measure. It really worked. It didn't hurt the poor. It was everything that carbon pricing could be. But the fossil fuel industry didn't like it. And ultimately, through the conservative government that came to power and the Murdoch press, they were able to sabotage it. Canada is trying to implement something similar. So it can be done. It's just one tool. It's not going to solve the problem on its own. We also need subsidies and incentives for renewable energy. We need to remove subsidies for fossil fuel companies. We need to think about measures to prevent the construction of additional fossil fuel infrastructure, stopping the building of pipelines, which is something that the new Biden administration can follow through on. It is committed to prevent the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. And there are in fact a number of pipelines that we're going through now under the Biden administration that can potentially be reversed. And so, we need to do all of those things, supply side as well as demand side. Supply side, stopping, the building of additional infrastructure, fossil fuel pipelines, et cetera. The demand side, putting a price on carbon, providing incentives for renewable energy, executive actions, and, again, things like disclosure of risk, requiring the sort of financial industry to disclose climate risk, something that they're starting to do in Australia. We need to do it here in the U.S., and Biden is considering that as one of the measures that they will use. Again, we have to fire on all cylinders here.
Yeah, I'm in. Dr. Michael Mann, he's got a new book out. It's called The New Climate War. You need to check it out. Michael Mann with 2Ns.net.